the Russia-Ukraine conflict has entered its most decisive and crucial stage. A lot of new information has come up, surprisingly from some of the statements made by President Putin itself, which will enable us to take a fresh look at the entire series of events that have taken place so far. Now, the fact of the matter is that Putin had launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 22nd last year. He had deliberately launched it as an Operation Invasion Light, L-I-T-E. And that is because in Putin's calculations, he did not want to, drive up or estrange his Ukrainian cousins beyond the point. He was very hopeful that he would be able to restore amicable relations between the Russians and the Ukrainian cousins, and therefore he had ordered his military staff not to go and fight in the classical, traditional Russian way of war, with heavy emphasis on mass, scale, and high tech. He asked them to go easy. He asked them not to use maximum force, and that is why he had insisted on this sobriquet of a special military operation. This conflict, therefore, in terms of doctrinal thinking, shows the clear cleavage and tension between the Gerasimov school of hybrid war, which is more recently and newfangled, and the classical Russian way of war that we had seen during the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, in which Russia had used, first, second, third echelon of forces in the mass, high tech, and used artillery as the god of war to bash through the battlefields. This invasion was a marked study in contrast. Russia started this invasion with just 150,000 troops. It is noteworthy that the initial strength of the Ukrainian army was 250,000. Quite obviously, it was a life and death struggle for the Ukrainians. They mobilized, they ordered full mobilization, nothing partial about it. They ordered full mobilization, and within a matter of months, their armed forces, their people in uniform, had reached a strength of 500,000, and there are even reports of 700,000 men available who had been fully mobilized for this war. So the force ratios were absolutely skewed from the very outset, and a lot of military specialists and military analysts were baffled as to how this major gamble had been undertaken. It now appears in hindsight that apparently false intelligence had been fed to Putin. Most people forget the fact that President Zelensky was elected with a thumping margin on the promise that he would bring or restore peace with Russia. As such, Putin felt Zelensky was a man he could talk with or do business with, because he was oriented towards peace. It remains to be seen if all this was part of a deliberate deception plan to lull the Russians and to gain time to build up the Ukrainian armed forces. You know that the Americans and the NATO were going all out to build up the military strength of the Ukrainian forces, and that Minsk I, Minsk II were possibly deception plans to keep the Russians negotiating while the build-up of the Ukrainian military was completed. Let me also be quite emphatic that even the Americans felt that it would not be much of a fight, it would be a walkover, perhaps when the Russians mobilized fully and they attacked, it would be, more or less a walkover, and what they were trying to give arms, weapons and equipment was for a prolonged guerrilla phase. They anticipated that the Russian armed forces would try and capture the whole of the Ukraine in one massive operation, more or less redux of what they had done in Hungary in 1956. Massive kind of assault. And the Ukrainians would have no options but to roll over. And like Iraq, they would wage a guerrilla war. So the weapons given were, the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, the anti-tank guided missiles, the TOWs, etc., so that they could wage a guerrilla war against the occupying Russian forces. That was even the American estimate. Let's not forget that. The Russians commenced their invasion 22nd February because they were able to mass effects of their rockets, cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, their Iskandars, Kalibirs, and also their hypersonic missiles to some extent, as also a bit of artillery, mostly in the south. They were able to make rapid initial gains, both in the Kyiv sector as also more prominently in the south. Within a matter of a month plus, the Russians were able to secure a land bridge to Crimea. They were able to cross the Dnieper River, establish a beachhead across the Dnieper River in the Kherson front, and they had come to the gates of Kyiv. Don't forget that their air assault forces had landed on the Hostomel airport in the very first 2 days. And then, if you recall, Putin had made that grand announcement demanding a surrender in Kyiv. It seems, like the Red Orchestra in reverse. Maybe some false intelligence had been fed to Moscow that there would be an uprising in Kyiv as soon as the Russian tanks reached the gates of Kyiv, and it would be a walkover a la Georgia 2008 and Crimea 2014. It would be Georgia redux. It was not. It was not, because the Ukrainians had been fully prepared, fully armed, trained by the United States and NATO to put up a good fight. Even at that stage, from the recent disclosures that President Putin himself has made, he was very keen to come to a negotiated settlement. He felt that this initial shake-up would be adequate to at least force Ukraine to the negotiating table and to talk. And if you recall, talks were duly held under the mediation of Turkey. We know these talks, 2-3 rounds of these talks were held. And now we are given to understand by President Putin himself that as part of a goodwill gesture for an overall negotiated settlement, Putin had agreed to the Russian troops withdrawing from the gates of Kyiv. They did not press home the offensive, they withdrew. There is also that baffling question of that long convoy which was stuck for days on the approach roads to Kyiv. And now if you put two and two together, it even seems like that was a famous halt order. You recall the famous halt order that Hitler had given before Pas de Calais, before the German panzer assault on the Dunkirk, beachhead from where the British troops were withdrawing. He had given a famous halt order. So did Putin also give a famous halt order? And, so confusion in the ranks, etc. Now, the fact of whatever it was, the fact of the matter is the Russian troops effected a withdrawal from Kyiv. The moment they did so, the Western information warfare machine went to town, trying to tout it as a rout of the Russians, that they had been defeated, they had been worsted, and they were retreating pell-mell. They were trying to get the hell out of the Kyiv sector. I'm sorry. In the light of what Putin has said, we will have to take another look at this whole Kyiv business operation. The withdrawal from Kyiv was absolutely orderly. There was no Ukrainian follow-up. They waited for them to get out, clear out, and only then that they advanced. And of course, they claimed it as a major, major victory that they had routed the Russians and pushed them back. Well, we'll have to take another look at all those claims. The simple fact of the matter is that they did pull back, and now Putin tried to concentrate. When the peace talks failed to materialize, Putin tried to now focus on capturing his stated objectives in the Donbass. He had captured about 90% of the Luhansk province, and in Donetsk he had done about 60%. Bakhmut was left, and I mean at that time 2-3 other cities were left, and he launched major attacks there. Now that was the most heavily defended area in Ukraine because fighting had been going on there since 2014. Quite obviously the process was very slow. Putin doggedly refused to mobilize, get any additional forces. That harried initial Russian contingent was forced to fight almost with one arm tied behind its back. And at the end of it all, they were left to hold 1,200 miles of the front. The entire front they had to hold, and these were troops that had been fighting non-stop for 4 to 5 months. They were tired, they were dispirited, they were looking forward to being taken out. Those conscripts they had finished their terms, they had to be demobilized. They were duly demobilized. And that quite obviously opened up huge gaps in the Russian lines. Quite obviously, these gaps were picked up by the American spy satellites, by the NATO satellites crisscrossing that area. In no other battlefield has the battlefield transparency been of this order. Every tank and soldier that moved could be picked up and was duly reported to the Ukrainians. Nobody else has had the benefit of greater intelligence coverage of the battlefield as the Ukrainian General Staff had. And not only was the coverage through via satellites and AVACs and JSTARs, drones, etc., but also by SIGINT, signal intelligence. That is why so many of the Russian senior commanders were spotted and killed just because they were talking on their mobiles. So this reached a very dangerous phase in that invasion, where Putin's insistence on still going light, left his forces confounded. Huge gaps opened up. The Ukrainians, advertised they were going to attack in Kherson. They did launch a massive offensive in Kherson. To, save Kherson, the Russian harried contingent pulled out troops from Kharkiv sector and the Bakhmut sector, and they pushed them to try and block the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson. They did slow it down for a month, but the operations were being conducted across the Dnieper River. The American supplied HIMARS blasted that bridge, blasted the land links, and quite obviously General Surovikin, the very experienced combat commander of the Russians, felt it was pointless trying to hang on to a salient beyond the Dnieper River, massive Dnieper River, if the bridges were going to be hit continually. Therefore, he pulled back that particular contingent, and now the Americans had also sensed the withdrawal order that had been given to the balanced forces, Russian forces in the Kharkiv sector, to withdraw to more defensible lines on the Oskil River, and thereby shorten their front, which was, as it is, getting out of their capability to hold with such limited forces. As they were withdrawing, the Americans sensed that, and they asked the Ukrainians to go hell for leather. They quickly mobilized 2 brigades and they launched a so-called grand offensive, and they claimed to have again routed the Russian forces, which were, as it is, withdrawing, and were under orders to withdraw to Oskil River line. I mean, this created a total image of fiasco. A superpower had opened itself to global ridicule by its insistence on going light, not fighting it as a full war, when it had become a full-scale war. This is the time that an outraged Russian general staff, I think they were able to prevail upon Putin. He came under a lot of pressure. and he had to order the call-up of 300,000 Russian reservists. Right? This restored military common sense to this conflict, because at long last the Russians had made a concession to reality. There was no question of a Russian intention to capture the whole of Ukraine with 150,000 troops. It was 1/10 of the force that was required to really carry out an operation of that scale. And the Russians had no intention. They were only planning to threaten Kyiv, and they were planning to take back Donbass, create a land bridge to Crimea, clear the Ukrainians from the Azov Sea coast, and if possible from the Black Sea coast totally. They had done all of that. They had captured all Ukrainian ports. Only the port of Odessa was left. 40 to 45% of the Ukrainian GDP as it is were nixed. So that is the time when the Russians mobilized. General Surovikin, he ordered the creation of a Maginot kind of a line to secure the area that the Russians had occupied, and they put about 200,000 Russian troops to hold this line, right? And this was a three-tiered standard Russian way of defense. Three-tiered standard Russian way of defense it was, and not only three-tiered, in places it went to 5 layers. There were the ditch, there were the dragon teeth, there were deep minefields, and then there were the Russians in very solidly built up trenches, and normally the Russian pattern, the trenches are in 3 lines. There were reserves behind. The Russians had gone back from the brigade organization back to the World War II style divisional organization. They brought up additional artillery, that they had now revved up their wartime production to full wartime levels for artillery ammunition, for production of more missiles. Everybody was saying that the Russian stockpile is exhausted, the Russians have had it, they are going to lose the war, Moscow is about to fall, etc., etc. I mean, such a hype was built up. I'm sorry, if you get so subjective, then you will be very rudely shaken up by reality checks on the battlefield. September, the whole situation had dramatically altered once Russia had ordered partial mobilization, and there are reports that they had done more than this partial mobilization, and possibly another 200,000 troops have been brought in terms of the next batch of conscripts. So what is the current situation? On 7th of June this year, Ukraine launched its very highly advertised offensive that it was going to give the body blow, the mortal blow to Russia. Russia had all but lost the war, and like the grand offensive they had launched in Kherson and the grander offensive that they had launched in Kharkiv, they would rout the Russian army. And that they had about 9 brigades which have been trained by the Americans, the British, the Germans, and the other NATO allies. They had been given Leopard 2 tanks, about 50 plus. They had been given about 14 odd Challengers, and they were supposed to be getting some MBT Abrams. Of course, they had been crying themselves hoarse for F-16s, but these have so far not come in. Halaki, the Ukrainian pilots are being trained in NATO countries on flying the F-16s, but so far the decision to give them have not been given. The fact of the matter is the offensive was launched with much fanfare, but it banged its head against the Russian defenses, which was almost like a Maginot Line, an iron wall, and they suffered heavily. The Russians were well prepared for this kind of an offensive. Their drones picked up the move of Ukrainian assault columns, their artillery, their missiles, and the Russian Air Force. The strategy was that Russia was attacking Kyiv and all the other key cities with heavy barrages of tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, as also their hypersonic Iskander, the hypersonic Kinjals, right? And therefore, all the air defense resources had been tied up for the defense of the capital and other important population centers. There was nothing really available to cover the assaulting forces. And because of this, the Russian Air Force now began to intervene in a far more significant manner than they had done hitherto. They had been kept well off because of the Stingers and the other air defense equipment that was being deployed. But now the the Russian Kamov helicopters, the attack helicopters, Hokum attack helicopters, they started firing with new anti-tank guided missiles that had over 7 to 9 kilometers of range. They kept out of the range of the Stingers and they started knocking out the Leopards. The Leopards have taken a big knock. Even the Kornet anti-tank guided missiles of the Russian infantry were able to take them on in a very, very massive way. Now, much hopes had been pinned on the Leopard 2s. Now, this is a German tank, top of the line German tank, even better than the Challenger, on par with, it's a diesel tank, on par with this thing. It can fire up to 1.9 miles accurately, 120 millimeter smooth bore gun, etc. So it was hoped that this tank would help in the breakthrough. But this tank and the Bradleys were the ones that were hit the hardest. And piles of tank carcasses and Bradley carcasses the Russians were able to put on televised display. Quite obviously, the Ukrainians were shaken up and they called off these attacks. They switched. Their very combat experienced commanders realized that it was no-go. They switched to infantry infiltration and attacks, trying to gain some trenches here and there. In all this while, they have managed to gain about 1 to 2 kilometers at the most. Mostly, the only gains that they made were on the flanks of Bakhmut, really. But in most cases, they were not even able to get to the first defense line, breach the first defense line. What to talk of the others? And all this talk that we would drive up to Crimea, etc., sounded like, so much exaggerated hot air. Now, when what was the Russian counter strategy? The Russian counter strategy was very reminiscent of what they had done in 1943 in the Second World War against the Germans. At that time, both the armies were on starter blocks, ready to launch major offensives. The Russians very matter-of-factly decided to let the Germans attack first, absorb their attack on their defense lines, inflict heavy casualties and disruption, and once the German attack had petered out or had been disrupted badly, they would launch their counter-offensive, more or less to mop up in the wake of the the losses the Germans had suffered on banging their heads against the Russian defense line walls. This was their precise strategy. This strategy was premised on the fact that the 9 Ukrainian assault brigades, which had been trained by NATO and the Americans, armed and equipped by NATO and the Americans, who had been given the Leopard 2 tanks, the Challengers, the Bradleys, old Soviet era T-80 tanks, etc., transferred from Poland and other East European countries, and they had been given a lot of artillery, etc., that that these 9 would be deployed in the offensive and that they would be given a decisive knock. But when the Ukrainians pulled back, the Russians also delayed their counter-offensive, waiting for the Ukrainians to show their hand. The Ukrainians had taken, fairly heavy casualties. In fact, Russian, the President Putin and Shoigu, they have all been claiming up to 23,000 Ukrainians killed in just from June to July in these 2 months. And 900 armored vehicles as per the Russian claims. Even if we go by half, these are serious casualties, and at this stage, is Ukraine in a position to suffer this level of casualties and recoup? As it is, their conscription gangs are going around picking up teenagers and youths from the streets and shoving them into the battlefield. So the Ukrainians were shaken up, their attacks have petered out, and they were now deciding to go very, very slow. And that is the time when there was a reality check in Washington, there was a reality check in the European capitals, and they suddenly realized that all the hot air about Kherson attack, blitzkrieg by the Ukrainians routing the Russians, I mean, that was so much exaggeration, exaggerated, highly exaggerated, insufficiently contextual accounts on which you can't base battle plans. It's good for propaganda. The TV war has been won by the Americans, Ukrainians, Europeans, hands down. There is just no two ways about it. But what about the ground combat? The ground combat, the Ukrainians were shaken up. This is the time the Russians decided that since the Ukrainians are not showing their hand, let them launch our own counteroffensive. As per Ukrainian intelligence, about 100,000 Russian troops with about 900 tanks and about 500 plus artillery guns have massed opposite Kharkiv sector in the north. And then the Russians very recently, they started their offensive. Now the moment the Russians launched their offensives in the Kharkiv sector, and they made initial gains of to about almost 4 kilometers plus in some areas, the American intelligence picked it up and they said, oh, there should be no Russian reserves now in the Zaporizhzhia sectors in the south and in the east, and therefore now is the time for Ukraine to launch her massive tank assault, as per the teaching given by the Americans and the NATO. There's a small problem here. The American and NATO war fighting methods of employing tanks in the mass is premised upon the gaining of decisive air superiority over the region of attack. Without that free air superiority clearing everything, and the Americans had spent in Gulf War I almost 45 days trying to gain this total air superiority or air supremacy. There was no question of air superiority or air supremacy over the Ukrainian battlefield. So what could the tanks do? What could the Leopard 2s do? What could the Chieftains do? The Leopards have taken the heaviest knock, and the fact of the matter is even the Russian T-80 and the T-90 tanks have been able to knock out the Leopards. Why? Because they have used their smoothbore Russian cannons also fire anti-tank guided missiles with much longer range. So they have been able to catch the Leopard tanks at standoff ranges. Well before the Leopards could engage, they have been shot out of the battlefield. So about 15 Leopard tanks, casualties the Russians are claiming. They are saying the entire thing given by I think Poland and Romania, they have all been knocked out, and total Leopards were 50. The rest the Ukrainians are now keeping in reserve, because risking them forward, one of the Swedish armored personnel carriers was captured intact by the Russians. Because if you risk these things forward when they are being knocked out by the Russian drones, by the Russian artillery, by the Russian anti-tank guided Kornet missiles, by the Russian attack helicopters, the Hokams, the Kamovs, they're knocking the hell out of these. And as per the Russians, they have decimated all these counter-offensives. Now, once again, we found that once they burnt their fingers, when under American prodding, the Germans were saying that you don't know how to fight, the Ukrainians don't know how to fight. The Ukrainians were quite stung. They said, that's rich coming from people who haven't fought since the Second World War. They're teaching us how to fight. I mean, training, classroom, lecture room combat is another thing, real combat is another. Our people are highly combat experienced, etc., etc. So all this bad blood has been going on. And now Ukraine has started, blaming the allies, the United States and the NATO, that they did not supply F-16s, they did not supply adequate ammunition. The simple fact is that there is not adequate ammunition to supply. The entire production rates, 15,000 rounds a month, are inadequate at the rate at which Ukraine is burning out ammunition. So when it is coming to the decisive fight, Ukraine is without ammunition. And it is as a desperate last-ditch measure that the Americans have been forced to supply cluster bomb ammunition to the Ukrainians. The problems will be with the Ukraine if they get back their territory. The problems will be with the Ukrainians for decades to come. Because not all these little bomblets from the cluster bomb munitions burst. They keep lying around the battlefields. They kill women and children later. And that's why about 100 countries have banned them. The NATO were dead set against giving these to Ukraine. But where is the option? The Americans are out of ammunition. The Europeans are out of ammunition. They are not onto the wartime production mode. They are not onto the wartime production mode. The Russians are. The Russian industry has geared up fully to keep supplying. They are firing 60,000 rounds a day. They are likely to fire more. We were told that the Russians would completely run out of missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, no more Iskandars, no more Kalibirs, no more Kinzhals, etc. I mean, please see the way Kyiv is being blasted day after day, Odessa is being blasted day after day. So the situation now is that the second wave of the Ukrainian assault has also more or less retired hurt. Now they are still not committing their full force. The Ukrainians are smart because they are trying to keep them as a last-ditch reserve in case Russia launches its counter-offensive. The options before Russia are to wait till the Ukrainians commit their second echelon, their second echelon of the Ukrainian, of the NATO and American trained equipment and formations, 9 brigades, part of them have already been used up. How much is left in reserve, it remains to be seen. But, the Russians are waiting to let them expend their major force before they launch their counter-offensive, ideally. What if the Ukrainians make a no-show? That is quite logical decision. Instead of banging your head against a wall where you made no headway whatsoever, So now they have taken to hitting a lot of the rear areas with HIMARS, with storm shadows, trying to knock out bridges, etc. And then they've started a series of attacks on Moscow itself with these small handheld drones which are, assembled by intelligence agents on the periphery of Moscow, launched. And then the full hype of the propaganda, you can see that, 4 drones hit Moscow. Putin is about to fly out to I don't know which other country. Moscow is about to fall. I mean, give us a break, because now the rest of the world has started absolutely disbelieving this kind of, highly exaggerated propaganda. Winning wars on television is easy. Winning them on the ground is a trite more difficult. Right? So anyway, so they are trying to cover up for their lack of battlefield success, for their lack of battlefield performance by using these optics. I mean, these drone strikes can be an irritant. They can be, they are designed more to irritate and more for symbolic value. But with symbolic attacks, you cannot win a war. This war now is in full flow. This war now is in full flow, and I think if Putin listens to his general staff, they may mobilize more and they might finish it in this campaign season. Because if they keep delaying, keep waiting for the Ukrainian offensive to come, for the Ukrainians to expend themselves, well, the rains and the snows will start, and we could then go in for a redux of what happened in February, which was the wrong meteorological window to launch the attack. That was delayed because of peace talks. That was delayed because of a whole lot of efforts by the French, the Germans, and even the Americans made an offer, which their foreign minister, Russian foreign minister, said that, seemed like they wanted peace, etc. So once again, that was used to delay this offensive. It ran into the wrong meteorological window, when the ground had become marshy, no go for tanks off the road axis. Tanks were confined to the road axis. Despite this, the Russians did what they could. The Kyiv area was bad terrain for tanks if they can't go cross country because a whole lot of wooded area, etc. So they paid a price for it. I'm sure they have learned their lessons. They seem to have ingested their lessons very well. And if the Russians mobilize beyond the 300,000, if they have already done so, then we can expect a major offensive towards Kharkiv. And if they mobilize more, we could expect, or I would not be surprised if another major offensive is launched towards Kyiv, a redux of what they had done, and the right window to do it is in the campaign season. So now let's wait and see what happens, but this battle is at its crucial stage. Russia has walked out of the grain deal. Russia has hit the Ukrainian ports very hard. Odessa, the port of Odessa, very hard. They are saying about 100,000 tons, 180,000 tons as per one estimate has been destroyed. Grains have been destroyed. So the Russian rationale is quite simple. Ukraine, all the other ports are with Russia now. The only port with them is Odessa, through which they were exporting this grain on the plea that the African countries, the Middle East countries were starving. The Russians say most of this grain has gone to Europe and not to the African and Middle Eastern countries. And now at this summit held in St. Petersburg, Russia has promised to give free grain and sell grain. They said we are in a situation to do so. It is the sanctions which have been imposed upon us which are stopping this grain sale to Africa and to the Middle East and to the other third world countries. So they had said that they would attack any ship that they'll deem it as hostile, any ship heading to Odessa. Some ships are now actually making an Israeli ship made a run to Odessa. So we have to wait and watch as to what happens. That could be another flashpoint for an escalation of this conflict into the naval dimension, naval domain. The Wagner group, after their staged so-called mutiny, is now all in Belarus, 20,000 to 30,000 of them. And they are quite well placed to move against Poland, to move against the Suwalki corridor. And of course, there are jitters going all over. Well, if Ukraine can send, so-called partisan detachments to create problems in Moscow, around Moscow and in Belgorod and other places, well, Russia can claim that so also its partisan forces, with deniability, can enter Poland and other NATO countries. And we are now headed for a very, very critical stage of the battle. It would be very sensible for all sides to now come to the negotiating table and hammer out a peaceful resolution of this conflict. From the recent statements of President Putin, he is also inclined. Saudi Arabia made an effort and did not call Russia for that peace talks. I don't understand how, if you don't have one party to the conflict there, how can you try to hammer out a peace negotiation? It's not a surrender negotiation by any chance. And therefore, we'll have to see if there is some honest broker. The Chinese tried, they haven't failed. The Russians are put off by the Turks. That only leaves India. India can be the honest broker now, and I'm quite certain the Indian foreign establishment is now in full lick. And if we do our calculations right, we should be able to get this crazy conflict now to an end. It's given a double whammy to the global economy. We had COVID first, followed up by the Russia-Ukraine war, inflation in energy, inflation in food, inflation in fertilizers. Now food inflation is again on the rise. And therefore, this conflict, in the interests of the entire planet, needs to be brought to a halt. The time and the stage for that is now. We will have to crucially look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the next 2 weeks for the decisive turning points to come. Either we could head towards a common sense, if common sense prevails, we could head towards a ceasefire and peace negotiations, and if madness prevails, we could see escalation, and that escalation could even go beyond the nuclear threshold. It could, especially if a direct conflict with Russia is sought to be initiated by NATO and the United States. I don't think they want that, but we've seen a lot of crazy things happening in this century, and we will have to hope and pray. Jai Hind.